George Shearing, of course, Lullaby of Birdland, of course. The style, the technique really, is what is called block chords, and it is something that was used earlier than when George adopted it, invented apparently by Milt Buckner. George did a lot with it that hadn't been done by Buckner, but the principle is this, to get right down to it. You take the melody, you play it in octaves, each hand, and you put in only 3 notes in between. Your left hand plays the melody there, but sometimes you can redistribute the notes. You might want to do 2 notes in the left hand like this, or only 1 in the left hand like this. In which case, of course, the right hand has to jump around a bit more. At any rate, you fill them in according to what the chords are and to the nice passing voice leading that fits. What George is a master of, I think more than anybody else, is the touch on the piano. This is something almost entirely non-verbal and indescribable, but when George plays any piano, you know that he is communing with the soul of the piano in terms of touch. Pianists play with different forms of touch, obviously, and nor does George always play with this delicate approach. But as opposed to, say, Bud Powell or Garner, who has a range, as a matter of fact, but could be as loud as this, or a softer, kind of a stiff-fingered manner. George is delicate, can be loud, but is always beautifully progressing from one tone to another, beautifully legato. And I think this is because George is very knowledgeable in all kinds of piano playing, from Bach to Impressionism to Romantic piano literature. He includes a lot of the classical techniques in his own playing. When George plays the famous block chord style, he discovered in his quintet that if he doubled the lower note with a guitar and the top note with a vibraphone, it came out with a gorgeous shimmering sound, if you can just imagine that. Now hear the vibraphone, and hear the guitar down here with the piano filling in the other 3 notes. Which brings us to a discussion, I think, about different types of block chords and how they resemble certain sections of an orchestra. For example, if you have 5 notes in the ordinary chord like this, you would use the same technique if you were writing for a saxophone section. Alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone. Again, the top saxophone and the bottom one, as in the piano block chord, would be doubling. Can you hear it? That's a saxophone section. Sometimes you do what some people call drop 2, that is to say the bottom saxophone is a 1/10 lower than the top saxophone, and you don't even need 5 of them. You can get a very good sound with only 4 saxes if you do, right? Now when you're writing for a big band, it's very analogous to what you would do in this kind of piano playing. Saxophone section, for example, might be the left hand. Brass section might be the right hand. Say you have, well, you'd have more than just 5 brass players quite often, but and they would double with a saxophone sometimes. Well, let's ignore that. Let's just say we have 5. Suppose we have 3 trumpets and 1 trombone for now, okay? So they wouldn't always be doing precisely the same thing. Sometimes you'd open them up so the saxes would have this, the brass would have this. But the orchestral style that George has and that Errol Garner has is very like what you would write for in a big band. Sometimes you might have the 2 sections diverge, as the hands might in this sort of passage, where they go in opposite directions. Sometimes you open up the voicing very wide, as you would in the left hand, and write everything else up here. Suppose you had 3 trombones and then a brass section and saxes up here. And this doesn't begin to talk about how you double the saxophones with the trombones, but that's getting into orchestration. My point really is that this kind of piano sound is very much related to a good orchestral voicing for saxophones and brass, and actually for strings too, but that's yet another orchestration lesson. But in all of this, George Shearing, I think, has the most lustrous, marvelous sound on the keyboard, and I think, as I like to say, has made friends with the keyboard closer than anybody else I know.